What is the stress of young people to go through a world that doesn't really see them as human? I'm not sure that our boys of color are thought of as children. And that the most harmful psychological assault that we have seen in our work on black and brown children is that we stop seeing them as children.
It is probably the most comprehensive gathering of research around males of color in one place.
We didn't want to begin that journey without first acknowledging the fact that the Males of Color framework is a problematic one, right? We wanted to begin our conversation not with some lofty aspirations that we have for the day, but with a real interrogation of some of the challenges inherent in this room that you see in front of you and in the way that we're framing this conversation. Some of us have come to this country as a result of violence in our home countries. Some of us have come to this country in the bellies of ships. Some of us have come to this country through violent crossings over borders and over time and over space. And we don't want to erase that history. We don't want to forget who we are as people. We also recognize the fact that a catch-all phrase that lumps folks together can also erase our reality, right? It can erase the fact that even though men in the Asian Pacific Islander community, in the Native community, in the Black community, and our folks in the Latino community are experiencing similar outcomes in many respects. They're experiencing the same outcomes around health. They're experiencing the same outcomes around incarceration. They're experiencing the same low rates of educational attainment. That similarity doesn't mean that the problems are the same, right? That similarity doesn't mean that the solutions to those problems are the same. And so even as we acknowledge our ability and our desire to come together as a field, we recognize those differences, right? We recognize and we wrestle with and we trouble and we problematize the very notion of this male of color space. And lastly, we recognize the ability of a sort of male of color umbrella to erase some real divisions we have in our current resources. We know that, depending on who you ask, but we know for a fact that a very, very small sliver, under 10%, most folks would say under 5%, some folks would even say under 3% of resources that come out of philanthropy go to folks led by anyone of color, right? So the overwhelming majority of that money goes to white-led institutions. But even within that tiny sliver, there are disparities, right? Even with that tiny sliver of resources that go to our communities, we know that disproportionately there's a greater infrastructure in the African American community for doing this work, and there's greater support for organizations that are led by persons of color. So even as we acknowledge the very real fact that all of our organizations are under-resourced, we also acknowledge that gap and that disparity in terms of the resources that we have in our varying communities. And we acknowledge that. We see that today, and it's reflected in the room that we're in today. And we didn't want to begin the process of this conversation. We didn't want to begin this journey without acknowledging the very real fact or the tension that's inherent in that and the very real danger that we would erase some of the things that are important to understanding this work and really to moving that conversation forward. That said, we are a group of people collectively that have learned how to cook every part of every domesticated animal in the history of the world, right? We are people collectively that know how to cook beans in 100 or 1,000 or 2,000, I don't know how many different ways. And so we acknowledge that even as we celebrate our differences, even as we talk transparently about the challenges and the tensions inherent in this work, we also acknowledge the fact that if anyone can figure out a way to make this space work, it's us.
A lot of you guys have been in the room. Y'all have been in these rooms where you're like, tricking your like nonprofit and philanthropic and friends who are organizers like in the room. They think they're coming to movie night, and you're really there to like, hey, we want you to invest in and think about men and boys of color, right? And like I think that's been the operative, or that's been the norm, for this work for a while, and we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond just the make the case conversation and bring a set of people in the room, institutions, individuals, people who are part of families to and communities to think about how do we make our work matter and how do we move the needle. There are a set of leaders of both organizations on the ground who are doing this work before it was sexy, right? Like before, everyone on my staff is laughing because I find a way to say sexy in every conversation. But like, I mean, it's always going to go down. But like before, but before it was really, really, popular and really, really important work and they talked about some of these organizations, Brother and Sister Soul and Barrios Unidos and Brown Boy Project and others were doing the work before there were philanthropic initiatives. And there's nothing wrong with being products of philanthropic initiatives, but everything's not going to change based on everyone waiting for, when philanthropy says it's important. That, there's a set of institutions who've been responding to what the community needs, and what the community said this is what these disparities look like. I mean, similarly, the African American Male Initiative at the University System of Georgia has been doing this work on a dime for 9 years, being supported by a conservative, sort of legislature that invests in it. Like that's not, you know what I mean? It was before it was cool. And so I think that's important. But then at the same time, there's critical mass because there have been some philanthropic leaders like, Campaign for Black Male Achievement and others who have invested in some institutions to give them the capacity to raise the level and capacity of their work, Shot Foundation, others. So we want it to be a gathering of leaders, for those reasons, to move beyond making the case, acknowledge tensions, and because there's a critical mass of a diverse set of leaders that can be a part of this important discussion.
Because man, we call it nurturing is just not a woman-mother thing. Nurturing is a father-man thing also. Do it. You got to nurture. We tell the fathers, nurture everyone under your roof. Even if your mother-in-law is living with you, you don't like your mother-in-law, she still needs to be nurtured. That's your job, fathers, to nurture everyone under your household.
What are straight male populations getting out of the work that the Brown Boy Project does? And in addition to that, in what way then do they become positioned as really important agents? And this is something that you alluded to earlier, to continue and further this kind of work.
Yes, our straight brothers are in the deep minority and they feel it the whole 5 days. And I think for most of them, this is the first time they've ever been in a space where they've been able to ask these questions. And I would actually argue that it's the straight brothers who take the most out of our spaces, because it's the first time they've actually started to think about who they are and their masculinity and gender. The way that I talk about it is in the Brown Boy Project, most of us haven't had a father present in our lives consistently across the board. Or we have had one and we've decided we are going in the opposite direction with forceful will and great abandon. And so the question is, how do we actually embody a masculinity that we can be proud of? And how do we transform that? So, controversial comment too. That what I think these straight brothers come to realize is that the policing of gender is literally killing us. And what's deep about it is that... Oh, it's about to be controversial. I think what's interesting about it is that not necessarily in the ways that we're thinking. So we don't talk about manhood. We recognize that manhood is really important for people, but we actually talk about masculinity because as folks of color, we can embody masculinity even if we don't identify as men.
I myself am Cambodian, and for folks who don't know about the history of Cambodia, between 1975 and 1979, a 4-year span, over 2 million Cambodians were killed or died through death and starvation. And my folks, on both sides, lost half of their relatives. So we come from a very deep historical trauma that has carried over to our experiences here in the U.S. I think policies and history have really divided our communities to really, pit our communities against one another. And if we can connect with folks on the ground level, it would just create a stronger base for us to work with in terms of changing policy and changing resources and things that we are able to get for ourselves.
I think that we need to continue to look at the policies that are affecting young people. Why are so many young people being sent to prison? They're getting ready to rid of DJJ, trying to. So now it gives prosecutors the direct file for young people as young as 13 and 14 to go to prison. So we have to look at those policies and see how, and there's so many talented men and artists in those institutions that we can reach out.
With letters to the corporations that were very behind the scenes, and we had weeks and months of conversation with the corporations to help educate them. It wasn't until corporations said we're not leaving ALEC that we escalated publicly. And so by the time we escalated publicly, there was no person inside of the corporation that could be surprised that they were being targeted. Some of them weren't happy about it, but they weren't we didn't know. If we only had a chance to talk to you first, we would have said this. They had multiple chances to have conversations. I had long conversations. Most of the time, the person who would call us and say, hey, we're leaving now, was the same person that we had the conversations with before that said they weren't leaving.
One of those individuals we had a conversation with was Andrew Wolk. And Andrew, and I'll allow him to tell his own story, but Andrew came to us from a social entrepreneurial perspective. How do you merge the different sectors of both nonprofit, business models, but also how do you also bring that into accountability measures that people will also be able to see the impacts and the effects in which you want to see the work that we're talking about, because that's all foundations talk about now. Sean keeps joking about Roy. He keeps talking about, Obama talking about taking care of Roy. And he's like, what's Roy? Who's Roy? He's like, return on investment. And I was like, I'm thinking he's talking about his cousin Roy or something. So we're talking about Roy. Leadership STEM Institute was about Roy. And Sean's like, he stole my joke.
I gave it to you. This is my collaboration.
My father was a 25-year veteran on Wall Street. And I like to say publicly that my angst and journey is how I bring these two worlds together. I have a very strong belief that there are actually a lot of principles in business that don't solve everything, but there's a rigor because of the amount of money they've been able to invest in the private sector, of understanding how to build strong organizations, and trying to apply that thinking from a public service lens to try to actually make impact and try to actually make progress to a sustainable model, how to measure your progress, similar to the way you would think about what a business plan does, and the communication with your investors.
I think that it's intentional to send our kids to, and our young people and our family members to prison because it builds the economy, right? So the privatization of prisons and that growing prison industrial complex fuels, I think, the political will not to improve schools, but to lock us up. So, I mean, I think that's another political context that's a little bit different then and now as well.
We also have a white paper or briefing or something that's coming out actually in a couple of weeks with the Alliance for Educational Justice and the Gay Straight Alliance. That is really targeting the issue of, it's the intersection of the school to prison pipeline and LGBTQ issues in schools, with kind of like the idea that we wanted to frame the issue so that the bullying piece doesn't do what you were talking about, doesn't move us over into we need zero tolerance in order to deal with this.
So think about a kid who comes from a stressed environment, may see his mom being treated violently, may have a family member who's incarcerated, is going to walk through perilous streets to school. And it's going to enter a school where there's a metal detector, there are people dressed in uniforms with guns or security folks. That child is going to have difficulty learning, managing emotions, and making the decisions. As a physiologic problem, it's easy to say this is a kid, this kid is, it's a bad kid, it's a kid who can't learn. When in fact what you're seeing are actually the effects of stress.
And that matters because it's certainly a more hopeful position that if we can decrease stress for young people, we can not only improve their present behavior, but we can improve their future health.